In the vast expanse of space, humanity stood as a newcomer among the stars, a young species with a desire to prove itself in a galaxy full of ancient civilizations and towering empires. They had joined the Intergalactic Alliance hoping to contribute something meaningful, but their first attempt at greatness had gone horribly wrong. The Unyielding was supposed to be the pinnacle of human engineering, an advanced warship that would symbolize their power and intelligence. But in truth, it was a disaster from the start, built with rushed deadlines and a lack of resources. The ship was slow, cumbersome, and woefully underpowered from the moment it left the dock. It was clear the Unyielding was a failure. Its engines sputtered and groaned, as if they knew they were not made for such a heavy vessel. Its weapon systems were weak and its hull was prone to malfunction. No one was impressed with the new ship. Even the engineers who designed it had doubts. There was no denying it. The Unyielding was destined for failure. But none of that mattered to Captain Elara Nix as she stood on the bridge of the Unyielding, staring at the vastness of space. Beyond, she didn't see a ship on the verge of collapse. She saw an opportunity, an underdog story waiting to unfold. She had spent years climbing through the ranks of the human fleet, earning respect from her peers with her sharp mind and quick decisions. Her reputation was built on perseverance and the willingness to take on the impossible, and now she was going to do it again, this time with a ship that everyone had written off. She looked at her crew. Each one of them had their own doubts, but none of them voiced them. None of them spoke out against their captain, because they believed in her. They had seen her turn nothing into something before, and they were willing to follow her once again. Elara knew the Unyielding was not perfect, but what it lacked in power it made up for in something more important: heart and determination. They would find a way to make it work. They would push the ship to its limits and beyond, turning its weaknesses into their greatest strengths. They had to believe that the Unyielding could rise above the expectations that had been set for it. The entire human fleet was watching them, and the galaxy was waiting to see what humanity could bring to the table. There was no time for failure. There was only the fight ahead. No matter how difficult, no matter how impossible the mission seemed, Elara Nix was going to make sure the Unyielding proved everyone wrong. She would not allow this ship to be remembered as a failure. She would turn it into a symbol of human willpower, ingenuity, and resilience. The Unyielding would become unstoppable, even if they had to tear it apart and rebuild it piece by piece with their own hands. Every crew member knew that their journey would not be easy. They would face dangers they had never imagined. They would face ridicule from other species and even their own kind. But that was the nature of humanity, to face adversity and turn it into triumph, to never back down when others told them they couldn't succeed. Captain Nix turned to face her crew, a fierce determination in her eyes. She didn't need to say anything. They knew what was at stake. This was just the beginning. They would show the galaxy that humanity had what it took to survive and thrive against all odds. The Unyielding left the safety of the dock and ventured into the unknown. A fleet of human vessels escorted them, but none could mask the uncertainty that hung in the air. It was a peaceful mission at first, a routine patrol of an uncharted nebula far from the core worlds. The crew had expected nothing more than a quiet journey through empty space. But as the Unyielding approached the nebula, the calm was shattered. Without warning, an alarm blared through the ship. Its shrill sound pierced the silence. Captain Nix stood from her chair, her eyes narrowing, as the sensors detected an unknown fleet on an intercept course. The ship's crew scrambled into action, their training kicking in as they tried to make sense of the situation. At first, they thought it was a friendly vessel lost in the nebula. But as the readings became clearer, the truth emerged. The unknown fleet was hostile. The ships were large and ominous, their designs unlike anything humanity had encountered before. The Scyther, a species rumored to be ruthless and merciless with technology far beyond anything the humans had seen. Their ships bore weapons capable of tearing apart entire fleets, and now they were closing in on the Unyielding. There was no time to run, no time to escape. The Unyielding was slow and underpowered. It could never outrun the Scyther fleet. No matter how fast they tried to push the engines, the crew was stuck in a deadlock with no hope of survival. Captain Nix ordered the crew to prepare for battle, But she knew deep down that they had no chance. The Unyielding was a ship built for peace, not war. But the HFY weren't interested in peace. They came for blood. They came to destroy the human ship before it could cause any trouble. The first strike came without warning. An energy blast rocked the ship's hull, throwing everyone off balance. Sparks flew from the walls as systems began to fail. The Unyielding shook violently as its shield struggled to hold the blast from the HFY weapons. But it was clear that the Unyielding was no match for the advanced alien technology. The human ship could barely withstand the barrage from just one enemy vessel, much less the entire fleet. Captain Nix gripped the edge of her console, her knuckles white. She refused to let her crew panic. She ordered evasive maneuvers, hoping to buy them some time, but the HFY ships were faster and more precise. They cut through their defenses with ease. Another blast hit their port side this time. The ship's engines went dark. A cold silence fell over the bridge as the crew realized they were powerless to fight back. The HFY closed in for the kill. Captain Nix stared at the view screen. As the enemy ships surrounded them, they were waiting for the final blow. They had no reason to spare humanity, no mercy, no hesitation, just the cold certainty of annihilation. Captain Nix's mind raced. There had to be something they could do. They couldn't just give up. She looked at her crew, seeing the same determination reflected in their eyes. They weren't done yet. They would fight to the very end. And maybe, just maybe, they would find a way to survive. She slammed her fist onto the console, signaling a full retreat. But the HFY were already too close, and it was clear that the Unyielding wouldn't survive another hit. They were trapped, surrounded, with no way out. Then, in that instant, Captain Nix made a choice. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. No matter how hopeless it seemed, they had something that Scyther didn't have. They had humanity's willpower to survive against the odds. She ordered the crew to reroute all power to the engines and shields. They would make a break for it, even if it meant sacrificing the ship's systems. They would survive and show the galaxy that humanity would never surrender. The Unyielding left the safety of the dock and ventured into the unknown. A fleet of human vessels escorted them, but none could mask the uncertainty that hung in the air. It was a peaceful mission at first, a routine patrol of an uncharted nebula far from the core worlds. The crew had expected nothing more than a quiet journey through empty space, a break from the usual hustle and bustle of galactic conflict. But as the Unyielding approached the nebula, the calm was shattered. Without warning, an alarm blared through the ship. Its shrill sound pierced the silence, making everyone freeze in their tracks. Captain Nix stood from her chair, her eyes narrowing as the sensors detected an unknown fleet on an intercept course. The ship's crew scrambled into action, their training kicking in as they tried to make sense of the situation. At first, they thought it was a friendly vessel, perhaps lost in the nebula. But as the readings became clearer, the truth emerged. The unknown fleet was hostile. The ships were large and ominous, their designs unlike anything humanity had encountered before. The HFY, a species rumored to be ruthless, merciless, and technologically advanced beyond anything the humans had seen. The enemy fleet was far superior in every way. Their ships bore weapons capable of tearing apart entire fleets, and now they were closing in on the Unyielding. There was no time to run, no time to escape. The Unyielding was slow and underpowered. It could never outrun the HFY fleet, no matter how fast they tried to push the engines. The crew was stuck in a deadlock, with no hope of survival. Captain Nix ordered the crew to prepare for battle, but deep down, she knew they had no chance. The Unyielding was a ship built for peace, not war. But the HFY weren't interested in peace. They came for blood. They came to destroy the human ship before it could cause any trouble. The first strike came without warning. An energy blast rocked the ship's hull, throwing everyone off balance. Sparks flew from the walls as systems began to fail. The Unyielding shook violently as its shield struggled to hold up against the blast from the HFY weapons. But it was clear that the Unyielding was no match for the advanced alien technology. The human ship could barely withstand the barrage from just one enemy vessel, much less the entire fleet. Captain Nix gripped the edge of her console, her knuckles white. She refused to let her crew panic. She ordered evasive maneuvers, hoping to buy them some time. But the HFY ships were faster and more precise. They cut through their defenses with ease. Another blast hit their port side, this time knocking out the ship's engines. A cold silence fell over the bridge as the crew realized they were powerless to fight back. The HFY closed in for the kill. Captain Nix stared at the view screen as the enemy ships surrounded them, waiting for the final blow. There was no mercy in their cold, calculating eyes. No hesitation, just the certainty of annihilation. Captain Nix's mind raced. There had to be something they could do. They couldn't just give up. She looked at her crew, seeing the same fierce determination reflected in their eyes. They weren't done yet. They would fight to the very end. And maybe, just maybe, they would find a way to survive. She slammed her fist onto the console, signaling a full retreat. But the HFY were already too close. It was clear that the unyielding wouldn't survive another hit. They were trapped, surrounded with no way out. But in that instant, Captain Nix made a choice. She wasn't going to go down without a fight. No matter how hopeless it seemed, they had something that HFY didn't. They had humanity's willpower to survive against the odds. She ordered the crew to reroute all power to the engines and shields. They would make a break for it, even if it meant sacrificing the ship's systems. They would survive, and they would show the galaxy that humanity would never surrender. The unyielding lurched forward, its engines sputtering to life in a desperate attempt to escape. Captain Nix watched the view screen, her pulse pounding as the HFY fleet loomed closer. The ship's hull groaned under the strain, barely holding together as it pushed past its limits. The crew worked furiously, rerouting power, trying to keep the ship's systems operational long enough to make it out of the Scyther's grasp. Every second felt like an eternity. The Scyther didn't follow immediately, as if savoring the anticipation of the kill. But the human crew was not ready to die. Not yet. As the unyielding limped away, Captain Nix's mind raced. They had narrowly escaped this time, but they couldn't rely on luck forever. Their engines were damaged, their shields were down, and their weapons were nearly useless. They were sitting ducks in deep space. If they didn't act quickly, they would never make it back to safety. Her decision was clear. They had to make the ship stronger, faster, better. It wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. The crew worked tirelessly, day and night, on the ship's repairs. The unyielding was their home, their last hope. And they weren't about to give up on it now. The engineers began making makeshift repairs, scavenging parts from the wreckage, and finding ways to repurpose whatever they could. The ship's systems were restructured, its weaponry improved with whatever scrap they could find. A group of technicians managed to reinforce the engines, pushing them past their original design to give the ship more speed, while others worked on upgrading the shields. The weapons, though still primitive compared to the Scythers, were re-engineered with what little resources they had. But it wasn't just the ship that needed rebuilding. The crew had to change as well. No longer could they be a group of hopeful engineers and officers. They had to become warriors, resourceful, and unrelenting. Captain Nix led by example, never letting her morale falter, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. She knew that the unyielding's greatest strength wasn't in its systems, it was in its crew. The humans would fight back not with superior technology, but with sheer determination. The ship's newfound spirit wasn't lost on the crew. Everyone, from the engineers to the communication officers, became part of the ship's transformation. They modified the ship's interior, turning unused rooms into makeshift combat stations and storage for weapons. Even the medics volunteered to help in the repairs, their skills being put to the test as they treated the injured and kept the crew functioning at full capacity. Days turned into weeks as they worked. Slowly but surely, the unyielding began to resemble a fighting force. It was still far from perfect, still riddled with flaws, but it was stronger than it had ever been. The ship's systems now hummed with a new sense of purpose. Its engines roared louder, its weapons gleamed with the remnants of salvaged tech, And the crew, though tired, now radiated a sense of pride and unity. They had turned their weakness into strength. Captain Nix stood in front of the view screen once more. The stars of deep space spread out before her. The Unyielding was ready. The time had come to show the galaxy what humanity was capable of. She glanced at her crew, all of them standing tall, prepared to fight. The ship wasn't just a machine now. It was a symbol of humanity's will to survive, to rise from failure and forge ahead. Captain Nix knew one thing for sure. They were no longer the underdogs. They were unstoppable. The Unyielding sat at the edge of the nebula, its systems fully restored and upgraded. Captain Nix stood at the bridge, watching the dark clouds of the nebula swirl ahead. They were heading back into the heart of enemy territory, and this time, the crew wasn't running. They weren't fleeing for their lives. The Unyielding had been reborn, and now it was ready to prove that the underdog could rise against impossible odds. The crew gathered around, each of them having put everything they had into the ship's transformation. It was no longer just a piece of machinery. It was a part of them, and they were ready to fight for it. Captain Nix looked to her officers. "We've made something they didn't expect," she said, her voice steady. "Now it's time to use it." Her crew nodded, eyes focused with a singular purpose. There was no hesitation, no fear, just determination. They had faced the abyss, and now they were staring down the enemy. The Tythar had made their first move, but now humanity would make theirs. This was more than a mission. It was a statement. The Unyielding moved cautiously through the edges of the nebula, scanning for signs of HFY ships. The damage from the first encounter still lingered, but it was nothing the crew couldn't handle. The upgraded systems hummed quietly, working together in harmony. The once sluggish ship now moved with surprising speed, its newly reinforced shields flickering with energy as they absorbed the deep space radiation. The crew was on edge but focused. Every movement, every breath, felt like it could be their last. But they weren't afraid anymore. It wasn't long before the Tythar appeared. Their fleet emerged from the nebula, sleek and menacing, each ship a well-oiled machine of destruction. The sight of them was enough to send a chill through the crew. These were the same alien warships that had torn into them months ago. The same deadly weapons, the same overwhelming power. And yet this time, the humans were not backing down. The Tythar made no attempt at communication, no warning. They simply fired. The Unyielding shields flared to life, absorbing the first blast, and the ship shuddered from the impact. The crew braced themselves, but Captain Nix remained calm. "Evasive maneuvers, full speed," she commanded. "Let's see how they like the taste of human ingenuity." The Unyielding jerked into motion, its engines roaring as it darted to the side. The Tythar ships were quick, but they hadn't anticipated this kind of movement from the Unyielding. The human ship danced through the space, swerving between the incoming fire, using every trick they had learned from their previous encounters. The Tythar fired again, but this time the Unyielding wasn't caught. The ship was smaller, more agile, and the crew used it to their advantage. Weapons fire erupted from the Unyielding's modified turrets, tearing into the Tythar fleet. The blasts were small, but they were precise, targeting weak points in the enemy ships. The Tythar responded with overwhelming firepower, but the Unyielding's new speed allowed it to dodge and counterattack in ways they hadn't thought possible. Captain Nix's eyes narrowed as she watched the battle unfold. The Unyielding was holding its own. It was clear that the Tythar hadn't expected the humans to come back so strong. They thought the ship was a failure, an easy target, but they had underestimated humanity. They had underestimated the Unyielding. Another wave of fire exploded against the ship's shields, and this time, the Unyielding took the hit head-on. The shields flickered dangerously, but they held. Captain Nix gave the order to fire the ship's experimental plasma cannons. The weapon fired with a deafening roar, sending a massive energy beam directly into the heart of a Tythar ship. It exploded in a burst of light and debris. The tide had turned. The Sci-Fi, once so confident, were now on the defensive. The unyielding had found its stride. And in that moment, Captain Nix knew they were no longer just surviving. They were winning. This was their fight, and they were going to finish it. The unyielding moved through space like a predator now, no longer a ship of desperation, but a symbol of human strength. Captain Nix watched the battle unfold on the view screen, her grip steady on the controls. The crew had proven themselves in ways they hadn't thought possible, pushing their ship and themselves beyond the limits. The Sci-Fi fleet, once a deadly and invincible force, was faltering. But Captain Nix knew this wasn't over. The Sci-Fi were relentless, and they wouldn't back down just because a few ships had been destroyed. "We've won the first round, but they'll come back stronger," Nix said calmly, her voice echoing through the bridge. Her officers nodded in agreement. They had seen how the Sci-Fi ships adapted, how quickly they learned from their mistakes. They couldn't afford to get too comfortable. The unyielding was holding its own, but it wasn't invincible. Not yet. "We need to hit them harder," Lieutenant Trask, the ship's weapons officer, said. "We've taken out a few ships, but there are still too many of them. They'll regroup and come back with reinforcements." Nix turned to face him, her eyes sharp with resolve. "Then we'll hit them first. No more waiting. We go after their command ship." The crew worked quickly, recalibrating their weapons and shields for a direct assault. The unyielding was now ready to take on the heart of the Sci-Fi fleet. They weren't just defending anymore. They were hunting down the enemy's leadership, aiming for the source of their power. The Sci-Fi command ship, a massive vessel at the center of the fleet, would be their target. If they could destroy it, they could cripple the Sci-Fi's ability to coordinate their forces and possibly end the fight. As they closed in on the Sci-Fi command ship, the unyielding maneuvered through the wreckage of destroyed vessels, using the debris as cover. The Sci-Fi fleet had regrouped, but they hadn't expected the humans to be so bold. The command ship loomed ahead, its dark silhouette cutting through the stars. It was heavily shielded and armed, but the crew of the unyielding wasn't afraid. They had no other choice but to press forward. "We're in range," Trask called out from his station. "Ready to fire." Nix nodded. "Fire everything we've got." The unyielding unleashed its full arsenal, plasma beams, torpedoes, and energy cannons tearing into the command ship's defenses. The Sci-Fi responded with overwhelming firepower, but the unyielding was already moving, swerving through the attacks with precision. The ship's agility, once considered a weakness, was now its greatest asset. The crew worked in perfect harmony, dodging fire while sending shot after shot into the heart of the Sci-Fi ship. The battle was intense, every moment a desperate struggle for survival. The unyielding rocked as enemy fire struck, but its reinforced shields held. The crew was relentless, determined to see their mission through. Nix's heart pounded as she watched the Sci-Fi ship falter. Their shields were weakening, the unyielding's hits were landing, and the enemy was beginning to retreat. But then, just as victory seemed within reach, the Sci-Fi did something unexpected. The command ship unleashed a devastating counterattack, a weapon the crew hadn't seen before. A massive energy wave shot toward the unyielding, overwhelming their shields and tearing through the hull. The ship groaned, and systems began to fail. Alarms blared as the crew scrambled to keep the ship from falling apart. "We've got to get out of here," Trask shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Nix gritted her teeth, fighting the rising tide of fear. "No, we finish this now." The unyielding continued its assault, despite the damage. It wasn't just a ship anymore. It was the embodiment of humanity's will to survive, to fight against impossible odds. The Sci-Fi command ship was weakening. The crew wasn't going to back down now, not when victory was so close. With a final, coordinated strike, the unyielding fired its last remaining torpedoes directly at the Sci-Fi command ship. The explosion was massive, a brilliant burst of light that consumed the enemy vessel in an instant. For a moment, there was silence. The Scythar fleet was in disarray. The Unyielding had done it. They had taken down the heart of the Scythar forces. The crew stood frozen, their breaths shallow, their bodies trembling from the intensity of the fight. They had won. But Captain Nix knew this was just the beginning. The Scythar would regroup, and they would come back. But now humanity had a chance. Now they had proven to the galaxy that they were not to be underestimated. And the Unyielding was unstoppable. The Unyielding drifted slowly through the debris of the shattered Scythar fleet. Its engines hummed softly, strained but still functioning. Captain Nix stood at the bridge, her eyes fixed on the wreckage. The battle had been won, but the cost was clear. The ship's hull was scarred from multiple impacts, and several systems were offline. They had given everything in the fight. And now, they were stranded in the heart of enemy territory. "We did it, Captain," Lieutenant Trask said, his voice filled with exhaustion, but also a hint of pride. "The command ship is gone. They're retreating." Nix nodded, but the victory didn't feel as sweet as it should have. The Scythar were retreating, yes, but that was only temporary. They would regroup. They would learn from their defeat, adapt, and come back stronger. The Unyielding was not invincible, and the fight wasn't over. "I know, Lieutenant," Nix replied, her voice steady. "But this isn't over. We've won a battle, not the war. We need to get out of here before their reinforcements arrive." The bridge crew moved quickly, assessing the damage and making plans for the next phase. The ship was badly damaged, and there was no way they could continue to fight without proper repairs. They had to escape, regroup, and prepare for whatever came next. But the vast expanse of space around them was eerily silent, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "Captain," said the communications officer, Lieutenant Cora, her voice sharp and focused, "I'm receiving a distress signal. It's faint, but it's human." Nix's eyes narrowed. A distress signal in the middle of Scythar territory. It was a miracle someone had survived out here, but a miracle wasn't enough. "Patch it through." The voice that crackled through the speakers was weak, distorted by static, but there was no mistaking the desperation in it. "This is the Hope's Reach," the voice said, gasping for breath. "We've been ambushed. We're stranded. Need immediate assistance. Coordinates." The signal cut off abruptly, leaving only silence in its wake. Nix's heart raced. The Hope's Reach was a supply ship, part of a fleet that had been dispatched to reinforce the human presence on the edge of the nebula. They had been out of contact for days. The fact that they were still alive, if only just, meant they had been cut off and left for dead. And now they were asking for help. "Set a course," Nix ordered, her voice cold with resolve. "We're going to find them." Her crew sprang into action, their focus shifting from the aftermath of the battle to the new mission. There was no time to rest. The Hope's Reach was their responsibility now, and they couldn't afford to let another ship fall. Not when they had the chance to do something about it. As the Unyielding powered up, moving slowly but steadily toward the coordinates of the distress signal, the crew continued their repairs. The engineers worked tirelessly to patch up the most critical systems, but it was clear the ship wasn't in optimal condition. The Unyielding was a testament to human perseverance, but even it had its limits. They had survived the Scythar's first wave, but the next encounter could very well be their last. Nix stared at the stars ahead, her thoughts heavy. The Scythar were still out there, and they weren't the only threat humanity would face. This war was far from over. But there was something inside her, something that had been forged in the fires of battle, that told her they weren't done yet. Humanity had been written off by many. But time and again, they had shown that no matter how many times they were knocked down, they would rise again. They had taken the fight to the Scythar, and they had won. Now they would take the fight to whatever came next, and the galaxy would know that humanity was a force to be reckoned with. The Unyielding moved steadily through the debris field, the crew working tirelessly to maintain the ship's integrity. Each crew member knew their part, each movement a testament to the resolve that had seen them through the worst. Captain Nix stood at the bridge, her eyes fixed on the display showing the coordinates of the Hope's reach. They were getting close, but the silence in the air was thick with tension. The distress signal had stopped transmitting, and all they had were the last, fragmented words of the Hope's Reach's crew. They didn't know what had happened to the ship or its people, but the only way forward was to get there and find out. The uncertainty gnawed at Nix. Every moment that passed without contact meant more time for the Sci-Fi to regroup. But they couldn't let fear dictate their actions. They had come this far, and they couldn't afford to fail now. "We're nearing the coordinates, Captain," Lieutenant Trask called from the weapons console, his voice tense. Nix nodded. "Prepare for anything. They could be waiting for us, or it could be a trap." The crew braced themselves as the ship approached a dark, quiet corner of space. There was no sign of the Hope's Reach, just the endless void stretching out in all directions. But as they got closer, something caught Nix's eye. A faint signal. It was weak, hidden behind a field of cosmic debris, but it was there. There, she pointed at the screen. That's them. The Unyielding shifted course, navigating through the scattered wreckage. As they drew closer, the shape of the Hope's Reach emerged from the shadows, its hull battered and burned, a skeletal wreck. It was still drifting, barely held together, but it was still intact. "Get a boarding party ready," Nix ordered. "We need to know what happened to them. And if there are survivors, we bring them home." The crew moved quickly, preparing for the mission. As the Unyielding docked with the Hope's Reach, Nix, along with her most trusted officers, boarded the damaged ship. The interior was dark, eerily silent, with only the hum of emergency lights faintly illuminating the corridors. The air was thick with the smell of burning electronics and old smoke. They found the bridge first, but there was no one there. No bodies, no signs of immediate life. The crew had abandoned the ship, or worse, had been taken. But as they moved deeper into the ship, they found what they were looking for: a group of survivors, hiding in the lower sections, bruised and battered, but alive. They had been under attack by a Scyther raid and had barely managed to send out the distress signal before being overwhelmed. "We thought we were done for," said the first officer of the Hope's Reach, a young woman named Ilara. "But we saw the Unyielding. We saw that human ship fighting back. We knew there was hope. You gave us a reason to keep fighting." Nix looked at Ilara, her expression softening. "You did what you had to do. Now, we're getting you out of here." The survivors were taken aboard the Unyielding, and the ship was quickly prepared for a retreat. As they left the wreck of the Hope's Reach behind, Nix stood on the bridge, staring out into space. That Sci-Fi fleet was still out there, but they had struck a significant blow. They had proven that humanity was not to be underestimated. The battle against the Sci-Fi was far from over, but now they had allies, resources, and hope. The Unyielding's crew had changed. They were no longer just survivors. They were warriors, ready to face whatever came next. They had lost so much, but they had gained something more important: a new belief in themselves. And that was enough to face the next battle. As Captain Nix looked at her crew, she knew the road ahead would be tough, but they would face it together. Humanity had learned the hard way that survival wasn't guaranteed. But if there was one thing the Unyielding had shown the galaxy, it was that no matter how weak a ship or a species might appear, they could always rise and become unstoppable.